His Majesty sent for 3 great scholars. These gentlemen, after they had a while examined my shape with much nicety, were of different opinions concerning me. They all agreed that I could not be produced according to the regular laws of nature, because I was not framed with a capacity for preserving my life, either by swiftness or climbing of trees, or digging holes in the earth. They observed by my teeth that I was a carnivorous animal. Yet most quadrupeds, being an overmatch for me, and field mice, with some others, too nimble, they could not imagine how I should be able to support myself unless I fed upon snails and other insects, which they offered, by many learned arguments, to evince that I could not possibly do. After much debate, they concluded unanimously that I was only replum sluclath, a determination exactly agreeable to the modern philosophy of Europe, whose professors have invented this wonderful solution of all difficulties to the unspeakable advancement of human knowledge. After this conclusion, I entreated to be heard a word or two. I applied myself to the king, and assured his Majesty that I came from a country which abounded with several millions of both sexes, and of my own stature, where the animals, trees, and houses were all in proportion, and where, by consequence, I might be as able to defend myself and to find sustenance as any of his Majesty's subjects could do here, which I took for a full answer to those gentlemen's arguments. To this they only replied with a smile of contempt, saying that the farmer had instructed me very well in my lesson. The king, who had a much better understanding, dismissing his learned men, sent for the farmer, who by good fortune was not yet gone from the town. Having therefore first examined him privately, and then confronted him with me and the young girl, his Majesty began to think that what we told him might possibly be true. He desired the Queen to order that a particular care should be taken of me, and was of opinion that my little nurse should still continue in her office of tending me, because he observed we had a great affection for each other. A convenient apartment was provided for her at court. She had a sort of governess appointed to take care of her education, a maid to dress her, and 2 other servants for menial offices, but the care of me was wholly appropriated to herself. The Queen commanded her own cabinet-maker to contrive a box that might serve me for a bedchamber, after the model that my nurse and I should agree upon. This man was a most ingenious artist, and, according to my direction, in 3 weeks finished for me a wooden chamber of 16 feet square and 12 high, with sash windows, a door, and 2 closets like a London bedchamber. The board that made the ceiling was to be lifted up and down by 2 hinges, to put in a bed ready furnished by Her Majesty's upholsterer, which my little nurse took out every day to air, made it with her own hands, and letting it down at night, locked up the roof over me. A nice workman, who was famous for little curiosities, undertook to make me 2 chairs, with backs and frames, of a substance not unlike ivory, and 2 tables with a cabinet to put my things in. The room was quilted on all sides, as well as the floor and the ceiling, to prevent any accident from the carelessness of those who carried me, and to break the force of a jolt when I went in a coach. I desired a lock for my door, to prevent rats and mice from coming in. The smith, after several attempts, made the smallest that was ever seen among them, for I have known a larger at the gate of a gentleman's house in England. I made a shift to keep the key in a pocket of my own, fearing my nurse might lose it. The Queen likewise ordered the thinnest silks that could be gotten to make me clothes, not much thicker than an English blanket, very cumbersome till I was accustomed to them. They were after the fashion of the kingdom, partly resembling the Persian and partly the Chinese, and are of very grave and decent habit. The Queen became so fond of my company that she could not dine without me. I had a table placed upon the same at which Her Majesty eat, just at her elbow, and a chair to sit on. My little nurse stood on a stool on the floor near my table to assist and take care of me. I had an entire set of silver dishes and plates and other necessaries, which, in proportion to those of the Queen, were not much bigger than what I have seen in a London toy shop, for the furniture of a baby house These my little nurse kept in her pocket in a silver box, and gave me at meals when I wanted them, always cleaning them herself. No person dined with the Queen but the 2 princesses royal, the elder 16 years old, and the younger at that time 13 and a month. Her Majesty used to put a bit of meat upon one of my dishes, out of which I carved for myself, and her diversion was to see me eat in miniature. For the Queen took up at one mouthful as much as a dozen English farmers could eat at a meal, which to me was for some time a very nauseous sight. It is the custom that every Wednesday, which is their Sabbath, the King and Queen, with the royal issue of both sexes, dined together in the apartment of His Majesty, to whom I was now become a great favorite. And at these times my little chair and table were placed at his left hand, before one of the salt-cellars. This prince took a pleasure in conversing with me, inquiring into the matters of religion, laws, government, and learning of Europe, wherein I gave him the best account I was able. His apprehension was so clear, and his judgment so exact, that he made very wise reflections and observations upon all I said. But I confess that after I had been a little too copious in talking of my own beloved country, of our trade and wars by sea and land, of our schisms in religion and parties in the state, the prejudices of his education prevailed so far that he could not forbear taking me up in his right hand, and stroking me gently with the other, after a hearty fit of laughing, asked me whether I was a Whig or Tory. Nothing angered and mortified me so much as the Queen's dwarf, who, being of the lowest stature that was ever in that country, became so insolent at seeing a creature so much beneath him, that he would always affect to swagger and look big as he passed by me in the Queen's antechamber, while I was standing on some table talking with the lords or ladies of the court, and he seldom failed of a smart word or two upon my littleness, against which I could only revenge myself by calling him brother, challenging him to wrestle, and such repartees as are usually in the mouths of court pages. One day at dinner, this malicious little cub was so nettled with something I had said to him that, raising himself upon the frame of Her Majesty's chair, he took me up by the middle, as I was sitting down, not thinking any harm, and let me drop into a large silver bowl of cream, and then ran away as fast as he could. I fell over, head and ears, and if I had not been a good swimmer, it might have gone very hard with me, for my little nurse in that instant happened to be at the other end of the room, and the Queen was in such a fright that she wanted presence of mind to assist me. But my little nurse ran to my relief and took me out after I had swallowed above a quart of cream. I was put to bed. However, I received no other damage than the loss of a suit of clothes, which was utterly spoiled. The dwarf was soundly whipped, and as a farther punishment, forced to drink up the bowl of cream into which he had thrown me. Neither was he ever restored to favor, for soon after the Queen bestowed him on a lady of high quality, so that I saw him no more, to my very great satisfaction, for I could not tell what extremity such a malicious urchin might have carried his resentment. The whole extent of this prince's dominions reaches about 6,000 miles in length, and from 3 to 5 in breadth, whence I cannot but conclude that our geographers of Europe are in great error, by supposing nothing but sea between Japan and California. For it was ever my opinion that there must be a balance of earth to counterpose the great continent of Tartary, and therefore they ought to correct their maps and charts by joining this vast tract of land to northwest parts of America, wherein I shall be ready to lend them my assistance. The kingdom is a peninsula, terminated to the northeast by a ridge of mountains 30 miles high, which are altogether impassable, by reason of the volcanoes upon the tops. Neither did the most learned know what sort of mortals inhabit beyond those mountains, or whether they are inhabited at all. On the 3 other sides it is bounded by the ocean. There is not one seaport in the whole kingdom, and those parts of the coasts into which the rivers issue are so full of pointed rocks, and the sea generally so rough, that there is no venturing with the smallest of their boats. so that these people are wholly excluded from any commerce with the rest of the world. But the large rivers are full of vessels, and abound with excellent fish, for they seldom get any from the sea, because the sea fish are of the same size with those in Europe, and consequently not worth catching. Whereby it is manifest that nature, in the production of plants and animals of so extraordinary a bulk, is wholly confined to this continent, of which I leave the reasons to be determined by philosophers. However, now and then they take a whale that happened to be dashed against the rocks, which the common people feed on heartily. These whales I have known so large that a man could hardly carry upon his shoulders, and sometimes for curiosity they are brought in hampers to Lorbalgrud. I saw one of them in a dish at the king's table, which passed for a rarity, but I did not observe he was fond of it, for I think, indeed, the bigness disgusted him, although I have seen one somewhat larger in Greenland. A coach was allowed for my little nurse and me, wherein her governess frequently took her out to see the town, or go among the shops, and I was always part of the party, carried in my box, although the girl, at my own desire, would often take me out and hold me in her hand, that I might more conveniently view the houses and the people as we passed along the streets. I reckoned our coach to be about a square of Westminster Hall, but not altogether so high. However, I cannot be very exact. Besides the large box in which I was usually carried, the Queen ordered a smaller one to be made for me, of about 12 feet square and 10 high, for the convenience of travelling, because the other was somewhat too large for my nurse's lap and cumbersome in the coach. It was made by the same artist, whom I directed in the whole contrivance. This travelling closet was an exact square, with a window in the middle of 3 of the squares, and each window was latticed with iron wire on the outside to prevent accidents in long journeys. On the 4th side, which has no window, 2 strong staples were fixed, through which the person that carried me, when I had a mind to go on horseback, put a leathern belt and buckled it about his waist. This was always the office of some grave, trusty servant, in whom I could confide, whether I attended the king and queen in their progresses, or were disposed to see the gardens, or pay a visit to some great lady or minister of state in the court, when my nurse happened to be out of order, for I soon began to be known and esteemed among the greatest officers, I suppose more on account of their Majesty's favour than any merit of my own. In journeys, when I was weary of the coach, a servant on horseback would buckle on my box and place it upon a cushion before him, and there I had a full prospect of the country on 3 sides from my 3 windows. I had in this closet a field bed and a hammock hung from the ceiling, 2 chairs and a table neatly screwed to the floor to prevent being tossed about by the agitation of the horse or coach, and having been long used to sea voyages, those motions, although sometimes very violent, did not much discompose me. Justly may I say that I should have lived happy enough in the country if my littleness had not exposed me to several ridiculous and troublesome accidents, some of which I shall venture to relate. My little nurse often carried me into the gardens of the court in my smaller box, and would sometimes take me out of it, and hold me in her hand, or set me down to walk. I remember, before the dwarf left the Queen, he followed us one day into those gardens, and my nurse having set me down, he and I being close together, near some dwarf apple trees, I must needs show my wit by a silly allusion between him and the trees, which happens to hold in their language as it does in ours. Whereupon the malicious rogue, watching his opportunity when I was walking under one of them, shook it directly over my head, by which a dozen apples, each of them near as large as a Bristol barrel, came tumbling about my ears. One of them hit me down flat on my face, but I received no other hurt, and the dwarf was pardoned by my desire, because I had given the provocation. Another day my nurse left me on a smooth grass plot to divert myself, while she walked at some distance with her governess. In the meantime, there suddenly fell such a violent shower of hail that I was immediately, by the force of it, struck to the ground, and when I was down, the hailstones gave me such cruel bangs all over the body, as if I had been pelted with tennis balls. However, I made a shift to creep on all fours and shelter myself by lying flat on my face, but so bruised from head to foot that I could not go abroad in 10 days. Neither is that at all to be wondered at, because nature in that country, observing the same proportion through all her operations, a hailstone is nearly 1,800 times as large as one in Europe, which I can assert upon experience, having been so curious to weigh and measure them. But a more dangerous accident happened to me in the same garden, when my little nurse, believing she had put me in a secure place, and having left my box at home, went to another part of the garden with her governess and some ladies of her acquaintance. While she was absent and out of hearing, a small white spaniel that belonged to one of the chief gardeners, having got by accident into the garden, happened to range near the place where I lay. The dog, following the scent, came directly up, and, taking me in his mouth, ran straight to his master, wagging his tail, and set me gently on the ground. By good fortune, he had been so well taught that I was carried between his teeth without the least hurt, or even tearing my clothes. But the poor gardener, who knew me well, and had a great kindness for me, was in a terrible fright. He gently took me up in both his hands, and asked me how I did, but I was so amazed and out of breath that I could not speak a word. In a few minutes I came to myself, and he carried me safe to my little nurse, who, by this time, had returned to the place where she left me, and was in cruel agonies when I did not appear, nor answer when she called. She severely reprimanded the gardener on account of his dog, but the girl was afraid of the Queen's anger, and truly, as to myself, I thought it would not be for my reputation that such a story should go about. This accident absolutely determined my nurse never to trust me abroad for the future out of her sight. I had long been afraid of this resolution, and therefore concealed from her some little unlucky adventures that happened in those times when I was left by myself. The Queen, who often used to hear me talk of my sea voyages, and took all occasions to divert me when I was melancholy, asked whether I understood how to handle a small sail or an oar, and whether a little exercise of rowing might not be convenient for my health. I answered that I understood both very well, for although my proper employment had been to be surgeon or doctor to the ship, yet often, upon a pinch, I was forced to work like a common mariner. But I could not see how this could be done in their country, where the smallest wherry was equal to a first-rate man-of-war among us, and such boats as I could manage would never live in any of their rivers. Her Majesty said, if I would contrive a boat, her own joiner should make it, and she would provide a place for me to sail in. The fellow was an ingenious workman, and by my instructions in 10 days finished a pleasure boat, with all its tacking able conveniently to hold 8 Europeans. When it was finished, the Queen was so delighted that she ran with it in her lap to the king, who ordered it to be put in a cistern full of water with me in it, by way of trial, where I could not manage my little oars for want of room. But the Queen had before contrived another project. She ordered the joiner to make a wooden trough of 300 feet long, 50 broad, and 8 deep, which, being well pitched to prevent leaking, was placed on the floor along the wall in an outer room of the palace. It had a cock near the bottom to let out the water when it began to grow stale, and 2 servants could easily fill it in half an hour. Here I often used to row for my own diversion, as well as that of the Queen and her ladies, who thought themselves well entertained with my skill and agility. Sometimes I would put up my sail, and then my business was only to steer, while the ladies gave me a gale with their fans. When they were weary, some of their pages would blow my sail forward with their breath, while I showed my art by steering starboard and larboard as I pleased. When I had done, my little nurse always carried back my boat to her closet, and hung it on a nail to dry. Joined as I was to the court, I used to attend the king's levee once or twice a week, and had often seen him under the barber's hand, which indeed was at first very terrible to behold, for the razor was almost twice as long as an ordinary scythe. His Majesty, according to the custom of the country, was only shaved twice a week. I once prevailed on the barber to give me some of the suds or lather, out of which I picked 40 or 50 of the strongest stumps of hair. I then took a piece of fine wood and cut it like the back of a comb, making several holes in it at equal distances, with as small a needle as I could get. I fixed in the stumps so artificially, scraping and sloping them with my knife towards the points, that I made a very tolerable comb, which was a seasonable supply, my own being so much broken in the teeth that it was almost useless. Neither did I know any artist in that country so nice and exact as would undertake to make me another. And this puts me in mind of an amusement, wherein I spent many of my leisure hours. I desired the Queen's woman to save for me the combings of Her Majesty's hair, whereof in time I got a good quantity, and consulting with my friend the cabinet-maker, who had received general orders to do little jobs for me, I directed him to make 2 chair frames, no larger than those I had in my box, and to bore little holes with a fine awl round those parts where I designed the backs and seats. Through these holes I wove the strongest hairs I could pick out, just after the manner of cane chairs in England. When they were finished, I made a present of them to Her Majesty, who kept them in her cabinet, and used to show them for curiosities, as indeed they were the wonder of every one who beheld them. The Queen would have had me sit upon one of these chairs, but I absolutely refused to obey her, protesting I would rather die 1,000 deaths than place a dishonorable part of my body on those precious hairs that once adorned Her Majesty's head. Of these hairs I had likewise made a neat little purse about 5 feet long, with Her Majesty's name deciphered in gold letters, which I gave to my nurse by the Queen's consent. To say the truth, it was more for show than use, being not of strength to bear the weight of the larger coins, and therefore she kept nothing in it but some little toys that girls are fond of. I had learned in my youth to play upon the spinet. My nurse kept one in her chamber, and a master attended twice a week to teach her. I called it a spinet because it somewhat resembled that instrument, and was played in the same manner. A fancy came into my head that I would entertain the King and Queen with an English tune upon this instrument. But this appeared extremely difficult, for the spinet was nearly 60 feet long, each key being almost a foot wide, so that with my arms extended I could not reach to about 5 keys, and to press them down required a good smart stroke with my fist, which would be too great a labor and to no purpose. The method I contrived was this. I prepared 2 round sticks about the bigness of common cudgels. They were thicker at one end than on the other, and I covered the thicker ends with pieces of a mouse's skin, that by rapping on them I might neither damage the tops of the keys nor interrupt the sound. Before the spinet a bench was placed, about 4 feet below the keys, and I was put upon the bench. I ran sidelong upon it, that way and this, as fast as I could, banging the proper keys with my 2 sticks, and made a shift to play a jig, to the great satisfaction of both their Majesties. But it was the most violent exercise I ever underwent, and yet I could not strike about 16 keys, nor consequently play the bass and treble together as other artists do, which was a great disadvantage to my performance. Junctures of perilous circumstances, from which I had already escaped, inspired me with a strong impulse that I should in time recover my liberty, though it was impossible to conjecture by what means, or to form any project with the least hope of succeeding. The ship in which I sailed was the first known to be driven within the sight of that coast, and the king had given strict orders that if at any time another appeared, it should be taken ashore, and with its crew and passengers brought in at Trumbull to Lorbalgrud. He was strongly bent to get me a woman of my own size, by whom I might propagate the breed. But I think I should rather have died than undergone the disgrace of leaving a posterity to be kept in cages, like tame canary birds, and perhaps in time sold about the kingdom to persons of quality for curiosities. I was indeed treated with much kindness. I was the favorite of a great king and queen, and the delight of the whole court, but it was upon such a foot as ill became the dignity of humankind. I could never forget those domestic pledges I had left behind me. I wanted to be among people with whom I could converse upon even terms, and walk about the streets and field without being afraid of being trod to death like a frog or a young puppy. But my deliverance came sooner than I expected, and in a manner not very common, the whole story and circumstances of which I shall faithfully relate. I had now been 2 years in the country, and about the beginnings of the third, my nurse and I attended the king and queen in a progress to the south coast of the kingdom. I was carried, as usual, in my traveling box, which, as I have already described, was a very convenient closet of 12 feet wide. And I had ordered a hammock to be fixed by silken ropes from the 4 corners to the top, to break the jolts when a servant carried me before him on horseback, as I sometimes desired, and would often sleep in my hammock while we were upon the road. On the roof of my closet, not directly over the middle of the hammock, I ordered the joiner to cut a hole of a foot square to give me air in the hot weather as I slept, which hole I shut at pleasure with a board that drew backward and forward through a groove. When we came to our journey's end, the king thought proper to pass a few days at a palace he has near Llanflasnick, a city within 18 English miles of the seaside. My little nurse and I were much fatigued. I had gotten a small cold, but the poor girl was so ill as to be confined to her chamber. I longed to see the ocean, which must be the only scene of my escape, if ever it should happen. I pretended to be worse than I really was, and desired to leave to take fresh air of the sea with a page whom I was very fond of, and who had sometimes been trusted with me. I shall never forget with what unwillingness my nurse consented, nor the strict charge she gave the page to be careful of me, bursting at the same time into a flood of tears, as if she had some foreboding of what was to happen. The boy took me out of my box, about half an hour's walk from the palace, towards the rocks on the seashore. I ordered him to set me down, and lifting up one of my sashes, cast many a wistful, melancholy look towards the sea. I found myself not very well, and told the page that I had a mind to take a nap in my hammock, which I hoped would do me good. I got in, and the boy shut the window close to keep out the cold. I soon fell asleep, and all I can conjecture is while I slept, the page, thinking no danger could happen, went among the rocks to look for birds' eggs, having before observed him from the window searching about, and picking up 1 or 2 in the clefts. Be that as it will, I found myself suddenly awakened with a violent pull on the ring, which was fastened at the top of my box for the convenience of carriage. I felt my box raised very high in the air, and then borne forward with prodigious speed. The first jolt had like to have shaken me out of my hammock, but afterward the motion was easy enough. I called out several times as loud as I could raise my voice, but all to no purpose. I looked towards my windows, and could see nothing but the clouds and sky. I heard noise just over my head like the clapping of wings, and then began to perceive the woeful condition I was in, that some eagle had got the cord of my box in his beak, with an intent to let it fall on a rock like a tortoise in a shell, and then pick out my body and devour it. In a little time I observed the noise and flutter of wings to increase very fast, and my box was tossed up and down like a sign in a windy day. I heard several bangs and buffets, as I thought given to the eagle, and then, all of a sudden, I felt myself falling perpendicularly down for above a minute, but with such incredible swiftness that I almost lost my breath. My fall was stopped by a terrible squash that sounded louder to my ears than the cataract of Niagara, after which I was quite in the dark for another minute, and then my box began to rise so high that I could see light from the tops of my windows. I now perceived I was fallen into the sea. My box, by the weight of my body, the goods that were in, and the broad plates of iron fixed for strength at the 4 corners of the top and bottom, floated about 5 feet deep in water. I did then, and do now suppose, that the eagle which flew away with my box was pursued by 2 or 3 others, and forced to let me drop, while he defended himself against the rest, who hoped to share in the prey. The plates of iron fastened at the bottom of the box preserved the balance while it fell, and hindered it from being broken on the surface of the water. Every joint of it was well grooved, and the door did not move on hinges, but up and down like a sash, which kept my closet so tight that very little water came in. I got with much difficulty out of my hammock, having first ventured to draw back the slipboard on the roof already mentioned, contrived on purpose to let in air, for want of which I found myself almost stifled. How often did I then wish myself with my dear little nurse, from whom one single hour had so far divided me, and I must say with truth that in the midst of my own misfortunes I could not forbear lamenting my poor nurse, the grief she would suffer for my loss, the displeasure of the Queen, and the ruin of her fortune. Perhaps many travelers have not been under greater difficulties and distress than I was at this juncture, expecting every moment to see my box dashed to pieces, or at least overset by the first violent blast or rising wave. A breach in one single pane of glass would have been immediate death, nor could anything have preserved the windows but the strong lattice wires placed on the outside against accidents in traveling. I saw the water ooze in at several crannies, although the leaks were not considerable, and I endeavored to stop them as well as I could. I was not able to lift up the roof of my closet, which otherwise I certainly should have done, and sat on top of it, where I might at least preserve myself some hours longer than by being shut up, as I may call it, in the hold. Or if I escaped these dangers for a day or two, what could I expect but a miserable death of cold and hunger? I was for 4 hours under these circumstances, expecting, and indeed wishing, every moment to be my last. I have already told the listener that there were 2 strong staples fixed upon that side of my box which had no window, and into which the servant who used to carry me on horseback would put a leather belt and buckle it about his waist. Being in this disconsolate state, I heard, or at least thought I heard, some kind of grating noise on that side of my box where the staples were fixed, and soon after I began to fancy that the box was pulled or towed along the sea, for I now and then felt a sort of tugging, which made the waves rise near the tops of my windows, leaving me almost in the dark. This gave me some faint hopes of relief, although I was not able to imagine how it could be brought about. I ventured to unscrew one of my chairs, which were always fastened to the door, and having made a hard shift to screw it down again, directly under the slipping board that I had lately opened, I mounted on a chair, and putting my mouth as near as I could to the hole, I called for help, in a loud voice, and in all the languages I understood. I then fastened my handkerchief to a stick I usually carried, and thrusting it up the hole, waved it several times in the air, that if any boat or ship were near, the seamen might conjecture some unhappy mortal to be shut up in the box.
End of Side 5.